Hi, my name is Kimberly Smice, and this is my case study for EDL 850, Copyright and the Computer Regulations Governing Technology. So first, let's establish the facts. So the facts about St. Regis. It is a rural community. It has 2 grocery stores, a drugstore, and other small businesses. Other communities come to St. Regis to get their supplies. It is 25 miles from the largest city. In St. Regis, there is one school that serves K through 8. It serves about 420 students. There are 2 teachers per grade level, 1 sped teacher for K through 4, and then 1 that serves the upper grades. PTA supports these activities, and when you get into high school, you are transported to the large city for school. The key participants today are going to be Mrs. Lynn, the library media specialist, Mrs. Williams, the experienced 3rd grade teacher who has taught at St. Regis, Mrs. Brandon, who is experienced but new to 3rd grade at St. Regis, Mr. Keith Sample, the principal, and Mrs. Evans, the PTA president. So let's talk about the incident. So PTA has 2 fundraisers a year where they raise money and they use them on teachers and they buy new computers or software every year. So after talking with Mr. Sample, Miss Lynn decided that this year they would be purchasing software programs with the funds, and they would install it on the computer lab computers for the whole school to use. So after 4 months of using the programs, teachers were excited and they went in their own classrooms. So Miss Lynn thought, why not? I'm going to purchase some blank CDs, copy them for the grade levels for each teacher, and distribute them. Mrs. Brandon, when she got to her to give it to her, she refused the CDs and talked to Mr. Sample about there being a violation of the copyright rules or laws. Mr. Sample then addressed it with Miss Lynn because this was the first time he heard of it, and she explained that she was saving money, she had the kids' best interest, and that Mrs. Evans, the PTA president, even helped her make the copies, and she was happy about how much money that they were saving. So that brings us to the ethical or legal issues. So when it comes to ethical issues, well, Mrs. Lynn is knowingly copying software programs that she knows is illegal, but she says it's for the students and saves money. So is that okay? Mrs. Williams and the 2nd and 4th grade teachers that accepted the copies probably know that they're illegal, but they took them anyway. So is that okay? And then Mrs. Brandon didn't accept the copy from Mrs. Lynn, and she ended up telling Mr. Sample about it, so he was aware. And then Mr. Sample, he addressed the copyright laws to make sure that he was within his ethics in getting that information correct. Then we come to legal issues. Again, Mrs. Lynn is making copies of software program that she does not have the rights to, so she's violating the copyright law. Mrs. Evans, the PTA president, also helped with this, so she is also violating it. And then those 5 teachers that accepted it, they're also breaking copyright law by having illegal copies. So let's recap the incident. Mrs. Brandon has brought up the concern to her principal, Mr. Sample, that Mrs. Lynn, who is the library media specialist, is illegally making copies of the computer lab software programs for other teachers to use on their classroom computers per various teachers' requests. So that's the issue. So let's talk about the facts. You have Mrs. Lynn, Mr. Sample, the 2 3rd grade teachers that are Mrs. Williams and Mrs. Brandon, and Mrs. Evans. Those are the key players in here today. And we kind of know where they stand on this situation. The unknown people are the 2nd and 4th grade teachers. How do they feel about it? Did they feel pressured to take them? Then you have the student at St. Regis. How do they feel about this whole situation? What about the PTA members? And what about the software program company? What will they say when they find out what has happened? And then what about the school district? If someone at the board finds out, or the superintendent, how will they feel about the situation that's going on at the school? Again, the place is in a rural community, 25 miles from the largest city. It has 420 students in its K through 8 school. It has the 2 teachers per grade level, the 2 sped teachers serving kindergarten through 4th for one, and the other one serving older students. And the high school students are bused to the larger city. It has also happened in the classroom and computer lab. So this is where the incident is happening because the computer programs are supposed to be on the computers in the computer lab, not in the classroom. The program, this is a public school, so it is federally funded, and they also are getting funding from the PTA for basic needs for the teacher and computers or software. And the program that they're using is that software program that's supposed to be on the computer. The unknown is a general curriculum. Maybe they're more engaged in this because it's more appealing to them. And we also don't know the type of software program, what it's being used for. So let's prioritize the information. Mrs. Lynn, she's there to educate students, being the library media specialist. She is purchasing the program software that's being used to help as many students as possible. She's assisting teachers with educating students, and she is supposed to be legally staying within copyright laws. Mrs. Brandon is supposed to be providing a good education for her students, educating or communicating any legal violations, and building a positive relationship with her coworkers. Mr. Sample is to follow all legal regulations, have his trust being built with the stakeholders, keeping a positive attitude and relationship with his staff, and communicate with others timely and professionally. What about our stakeholders? Well, the St. Regis teachers, they're there to teach students. They also should be communicating any legal violations that they see, and they should be having a positive relationships with their students and their staff members. The students, we want them to be engaged in their learning and excited about the new software program and having the opportunity to use it frequently. Mrs. Evans, she's that PTA president. She's supposed to be leading all the fundraisers and following all legal and school regulations. And the PTA is, again, a fundraiser. They do fundraising for the school, and they purchase items for the teachers. So all those members are there to help the school. So what are some effects on the stakeholders because of all this information? Well, if the software company finds out that St. Regis has violated the program's copyright, there could be a lawsuit, fine, or a withdrawal of the contract between the school and the company. Mr. Sample did talk about the copyright violation with Mrs. Lynn, and he has not talked to anyone that accepted the software program CDs or the PTA president. He still needs to find out how the other teachers feel about the software program. Were they just trying to be nice and they took it? Did they not know about the violation? And then also Mrs. Evans' involvement. Does she know about the law? Is there more money so they could purchase more programs? And also, what is the Board of Education policy? In his decision, there are still many questions that he needs to have answered before he can determine that the software computer copies need to be destroyed and taken off of the computers. So he just needs to follow some more steps before he gets to that step in the process. So let's identify some options. So there's a lot of options for Mr. Sample. He could ignore the situation, not do anything at all, talk to Miss Lynn, keep going the way that they're supposed to be going. People can still use it. Number 2, he could fire Mrs. Lynn, say you violated the copyright rules, that she could destroy it, just saying we're done. Then you could also destroy the copies. Just go in there, delete all the copies off, collect them, destroy them. They're gone. You could ignore Mrs. Brandon's concerns. So you could talk to Mrs. Brandon after talking to Mrs. Lynn, tell her the reason that the copies were made, continue using it, continue to break the copyright law. And finally, he could provide professional development, create a PowerPoint about copyright laws, involve Mrs. Lynn, present it to the staff, and then end up destroying it afterwards. So there's different pros and cons. If you ignore the situation, teachers are happy, they get to use it, you still have your positive relationship. But on the other hand, you're violating copyright. And if you get caught, that would be, there could be negative consequences. You're continuing the misbehavior, and you're probably going to upset Mrs. Brandon, who brought it to your attention. If you fire Mrs. Lynn, you show that you're taking copyright violations seriously, and the copies would be destroyed. But the cons would be you'd probably lose a valuable staff member. She's been there for a while. And you'd also lose trust with remaining staff. If you just fired someone, they'll be afraid you could be next for making a mistake. Number 3, destroying the copies. Well, you'd be following the copyright regulations, and no one else would be involved in the incident. But the cons would be teachers would question if the programs were just gone, if they didn't know why. Mrs. Lynn could feel offended by the destruction, and you'd have to ultimately purchase more copies to fulfill that for the teachers. If you ignore Mrs. Brandon, well, the teachers will continue to use their copied programs, and Mrs. Lynn would be happy about her decision. The positive relationships with the staff would continue besides Mrs. Brandon. And the con would be you probably lose trust with Mrs. Brandon. She probably wouldn't come back to bring up any more concerns. She'd end up quitting, and you'd still be violating copyright laws. And the last one, professional development. Everyone would be educated on copyright rules and laws, and they would understand why we can't copy computer programs. We'd all be on the same page. You could involve Mrs. Lynn in the education process of it and raising her awareness, build trust with your staff, and also follow copyright laws in the future. But the cons would be teachers might be upset that they can't use the copied programs, and you'd ultimately have to purchase more copies by asking the PTA for it. So the best option is to do the professional development on copyright laws. Mr. Sample would ask Mrs. Lynn to help facilitate the professional development. Mr. Sample and Mrs. Lynn would work together to create the presentation. All staff members would be asked to attend. Mr. and Mrs. Lynn would complete the presentation. The presentation could then be taken to the PTA, and then all program copies could be collected and destroyed. So to go into a little bit more detail, you could explain the importance of following the copyright laws to Mrs. Lynn so she understood. Present Mrs. Lynn with the opportunity to lead a PD about copyright laws alongside Mr. Sample at the next faculty meeting, so then she has that buy-in and also can see her importance in the role. Then the two would work together to create the presentation. They would invite all staff, which would be teachers and paras, to the meeting. They would share the presentation, and if someone was absent, Mr. Sample would make sure to get the presentation to them. At the end, they could bring up the discussion of the copied software programs that were handed out to the teachers and explain how they need to be destroyed, or have the teachers discuss that, and then they could agree with it. They would then collect and destroy all the copies, and they would bring the presentation to the PTA to show the importance of their fundraising and why it's important to have enough resources for all their students, and possibly see if they have enough money to purchase more. If someone refuses to give up that copy, though, you could remind them of the copyright law, and if Mr. Sample had to, he could take it further up into the district office to see what consequence that could happen afterwards. So in conclusion, Mr. Sample has worked very hard in building relationships with his staff over the past 3 years. It is important that he keeps their trust, but also educates them on the proper use of copyrighted materials. Involving Mrs. Lynn will allow herself to be able to be involved in the process and answer other copyrighted material questions as part of her job. And taking care of this situation may seem stressful to Mr. Sample at first, but it is the right thing to do to avoid any future or more severe violations. So thank you for your time. These are the resources and where I found my information for this project. Have a great day.